Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Speak Smart podcast. Today, we're going to be diving deep into some tips and techniques for all of you out there who are beginning to learn English. We've got this transcript of a podcast episode. It's actually designed for beginners. And I think there's a lot to unpack, even if you're not brand new to the language.
Yeah, there really is. I think what's exciting about this particular source is it kind of goes beyond the basics, like how to conjugate a verb or, simple greetings and things like that. It really dives into the mindset and the habits that will make you a successful language learner, which applies to everybody, no matter your skill level.
That's cool. All right, well, let's jump right in. One of the first things that this podcast emphasizes is the importance of learning English. They even go so far as to say that speaking English is like having a superpower. What do you think about that analogy?
I think that's such a brilliant way to capture the potential that comes with being fluent in English. Because if you think about it, you have access to global opportunities. You can make friends all over the world. You can travel easily. You can engage with so much more media. I mean, the possibilities are pretty much endless when you speak English.
Yeah, you're really kind of expanding your world in every sense of the word when you learn English. And I think on a more practical level, strong English skills are super valuable for your career, your education, and just kind of navigating daily life.
Absolutely. I mean, English has become the lingua franca of our time. It's the language of business science, international communication, like you name it. So if you have a good grasp of English, it gives you such an advantage in so many different areas.
It really is like this key that unlocks all these doors for you. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. How do you actually learn the language? Well, the podcast breaks it down into three core areas: vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation.
It's kind of like laying the foundation of a building, right? You need all of those pieces to create a strong and functional structure. So let's start with vocabulary. This source really emphasizes practical techniques, things like making flashcards and using new words in context. It's not just about rote memorization. It's about actively using the words that you learn in your everyday life.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. You can look up a word in a dictionary, but unless you see it in action and understand how it's actually used, it doesn't really mean anything to you.
Right. It's all about context, and you can get that context by listening to podcasts, watching movies. All of those things help you see how native speakers actually use the language.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what about grammar? I know a lot of people find this to be the most intimidating part of learning a language.
For sure. But this podcast suggests starting with the basics, master those fundamental rules before you move on to the more complicated stuff.
Yeah, it's like building a house. You need to have a strong foundation before you can add all the fancy details.
Exactly. And just like with vocabulary, practice is key. The more you use those grammar structures in speaking and writing, the more natural they will become.
All right, so let's move on to pronunciation. This podcast actually gives some very simple advice for improving your pronunciation. Listen to and imitate native speakers.
I think that's such a great tip, because it's all about getting used to the rhythm and the melody of the language. Kind of like if you were learning a musical instrument, you would listen to experienced musicians and try to copy what they do.
That's a great analogy. So we've talked about the importance of vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation, but this podcast also makes a really big point about making language learning enjoyable. It shouldn't feel like a chore.
Absolutely. They really emphasize finding activities that are fun for you and incorporating those into your learning routine.
Yeah, like reading, watching movies, listening to music, playing games. These are all things that you can do in English and enjoy at the same time.
Yeah, it's like turning your leisure time into a learning opportunity.
Yeah, and the great thing is you're not only having fun, you're also passively absorbing the language. So you're learning new vocabulary, getting used to different accents. It's a win-win.
Absolutely. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that you learn better when you're having fun.
That's cool.
Yeah.
So we've covered a lot of positive stuff so far, but of course there are also challenges that come with learning any new language. This podcast specifically mentions staying motivated, overcoming fear, and finding time to practice.
Yeah, these are hurdles that pretty much everyone faces.
Yeah, for sure.
And they can feel especially daunting when you're first starting out.
Yeah, I can imagine.
It's easy to get discouraged or feel overwhelmed or even doubt your ability to actually become fluent.
Yeah.
But the key is to develop strategies for overcoming those obstacles.
Yeah.
And to remember that every successful language learner has faced those same challenges at some point.
It's a good point. It's all about finding what works best for you and not giving up.
Exactly. And remember, language learning is a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
There are going to be ups and downs, moments of frustration and moments of triumph. But the important thing is to enjoy the process.
That's great advice. Celebrate those small victories and keep your eye on the prize, which is being able to communicate confidently in English.
Yeah, that's what it's all about.
So we've covered a lot of ground already today. We've talked about the importance of learning English, those core building blocks like vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and even some of the challenges that learners might face. But there's still so much more to explore. Welcome back to the Speak Smart podcast. We're picking up right where we left off, diving deep into some really awesome tips and techniques for learning English, especially for those of you who are just getting started. Last time we talked about the why of learning English, those crucial building blocks of vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation. Now let's get practical. Let's talk about how to make this process actually fun and effective.
Yeah. Because remember, this podcast we're looking at really emphasizes that enjoyment factor. It's not about, just memorizing things or doing these boring exercises. It's about finding ways to integrate English into your daily life in a way that you actually enjoy.
Yeah, and they give some really creative suggestions for doing just that. Reading, watching movies, listening to music, even playing games. These are all activities that you can kind of seamlessly blend with your language learning.
Right. So let's start with reading. This podcast really encourages you to choose material that actually interests you, whether that's novels, magazines, blogs, or even just, social media posts. The key is to find things that you're actually passionate about and kind of lose yourself in the world of words.
I think that's so important. When you're genuinely enjoying the content, the language learning almost becomes secondary. But it's happening in the background.
Yeah.
You're expanding your vocabulary, you're absorbing those grammatical structures, and you're getting a feel for the natural flow of the language without even realizing it.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to start with material that's maybe a little bit below your current level, because it's better to enjoy the experience and understand most of what you're reading than to struggle through something that's too difficult and lose motivation.
That makes sense. All right, let's talk about movies and TV shows. I know this is one of my favorite ways to learn languages.
Yeah, me too.
It's like you're getting this window into another culture.
Oh.
And you're picking up on those little nuances of communication that you wouldn't necessarily find in a textbook.
Right. You're exposed to different accents, colloquialisms, everyday expressions. It's like a crash course in how people actually speak.
Exactly. And with all the streaming services we have these days, you have access to a whole world of content.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Oh, and don't forget about subtitles. Especially when you're starting out, those can be super helpful.
Yeah. It's like having a built-in translator.
Yeah.
Helping you connect those spoken words with the written form.
And as your listening comprehension improves, you can gradually wean yourself off the subtitles.
Right.
So you're challenging yourself to understand the dialogue without that visual aid.
It's a good way to track your progress.
So what about games? The podcast mentions word games specifically, things like Scrabble and Boggle, which are great for building vocabulary and spelling skills.
Yeah, but honestly, any game that involves language can be a fun way to practice.
Yeah, even something as simple as charades.
Exactly. Because games introduce that element of playfulness and competition, which can actually make learning more engaging and memorable.
Yeah.
And it kind of takes the pressure off.
Yeah, you can experiment with the language in a more relaxed environment.
Right.
And it's a great way to connect with other people who are learning English too.
Yeah.
You can form a study group or join an online community, or even just find a language partner to practice with regularly.
Yeah, having that social interaction and that support system can make a huge difference.
So we've talked about reading. We've talked about watching movies and TV shows. We've talked about playing games. What about music? That's another great way to kind of immerse yourself in the language.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, music is a universal language. It can connect people from all over the world.
Yeah.
And it's just a really powerful tool for learning.
Yeah. I've always loved listening to music in other languages. You learn new vocabulary. You get a feel for the rhythm and the intonation.
Yeah.
And you might even pick up some slang and colloquialisms along the way.
Right. And the best part is there's a genre of music out there for everyone.
Yeah.
So no matter what your taste is, you can find something you enjoy in English.
Okay, so we've covered all these amazing techniques for making language learning fun. But now let's address the elephant in the room. The challenges that inevitably come up.
Right.
The podcast talks about staying motivated, overcoming fear, and finding time to practice. These are hurdles that every language learner faces at some point.
Yeah. And they can feel really overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially when you're just starting out.
So let's start with motivation. It's easy to feel all gung-ho at the beginning, but how do you maintain that momentum when the novelty wears off? And you're faced with the day-to-day grind of actually learning the language.
Well, this podcast has some good advice for that. They talk about setting achievable goals, celebrating small wins, and focusing on the progress you're making, rather than getting bogged down by perfectionism.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Instead of focusing on this huge mountain you have to climb, break it down into smaller, more manageable hills. And celebrate each summit, each milestone that you reach. Use that positive reinforcement to keep yourself going.
Exactly. And remember, language learning is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
It's about consistency and persistence, showing up every day, even if it's just for a few minutes, and, chipping away at that mountain one step at a time.
Okay, so let's talk about fear. Fear of making mistakes, fear of sounding silly, fear of being judged. These are all very real emotions that can really hold us back.
Yeah, they can be so paralyzing.
So how do we overcome these fears and embrace those inevitable stumbles along the way?
Well, the podcast suggests creating a supportive learning environment, whether that's finding a language partner who's patient and encouraging, joining an online community where people are really supportive, or even just reminding yourself that everyone makes mistakes, especially when they're learning something new.
It's like giving yourself permission to be a beginner, to stumble, to make mistakes, to laugh at yourself, and to learn from those experiences.
Right. It's about shifting your mindset from a fear of failure to a growth mindset, where you see those mistakes as opportunities to learn and improve.
I love that. And remember, the more you practice speaking, the more comfortable you'll become.
Absolutely.
It's like any skill, the more you do it, the easier it gets.
Right.
So don't be afraid to put yourself out there, even if it feels awkward or uncomfortable at first.
Yeah, just keep speaking.
Okay, so the last challenge we'll talk about is finding time to practice. In our busy lives, it can be really difficult to carve out dedicated time for language learning.
Yeah, it can feel impossible sometimes.
So what do we do?
Well, this podcast suggests incorporating English practice into your daily routine, even if it's just for a few minutes here and there.
Yeah, that's such a practical tip. Instead of trying to block off, these huge chunks of time, just think about small, manageable ways to integrate English into your existing schedule.
Right.
Like you could listen to a podcast while you're commuting, watch a short video during your lunch break, read a news article before bed.
Exactly. Those small, consistent efforts really add up over time.
It's like the compound interest of language learning. You make these little deposits of practice, and over time, they lead to significant gains in fluency.
That's a great way to think about it.
So don't underestimate the power of those micro moments of learning.
Yeah.
Even just 5 minutes here and there can make a difference.
It's all about being intentional and consistent.
Well, that brings us to the end of part 2 of our deep dive. We've explored some really awesome techniques for making language learning enjoyable, as well as some practical strategies for overcoming those inevitable challenges. But there's one more crucial element that we need to address, and that's confidence. Welcome back to the Speak Smart podcast. We're in the final stretch of our deep dive into these awesome tips and techniques for learning English, especially for you beginners out there. We've talked about why it's so important to learn English, those core building blocks like vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and even how to make the process fun with things like movies and music. But now let's talk about a crucial element that kind of ties everything together: confidence.
Yeah, confidence is key. It's what keeps us going. It's that inner voice that says, hey, I can actually do this.
Yeah, it's like that belief in yourself that you can achieve your goals.
Exactly. And the great thing about confidence is that it's not something you're born with. It's something you can develop over time.
It's like a muscle that gets stronger the more you use it. And this podcast we're analyzing gives some great strategies for building that confidence muscle when it comes to language learning.
Yeah. So one of the first things they emphasize is focusing on progress, not perfection. It's so easy to get caught up in those mistakes that we all make and compare ourselves to native speakers and feel like we're not good enough.
Yeah, I think we all do that from time to time.
But it's important to remember that everyone makes mistakes, especially when you're learning something new.
It's part of the process.
Exactly. And instead of beating yourself up over those mistakes, try to see them as opportunities to learn and grow.
Yeah, I love that they frame it as a positive thing.
It's about shifting your mindset from self-criticism to self-compassion.
Yeah.
Celebrate those small wins, like when you use a new word correctly or you finally understand a grammar rule.
Yeah, those little victories can really add up.
They really do.
And the podcast also talks about surrounding yourself with a supportive community, people who encourage you and lift you up on your language learning journey.
Yeah, that's so important. Find a language partner who's patient and understanding. Or join an online community where people are supportive and non-judgmental.
Yeah, having that network can make a world of difference.
It really can.
It's like having your own personal cheerleading squad,
Exactly.
cheering you on every step of the way.
All right, so we've talked about celebrating progress and creating a supportive community. What about visualization?
Oh yeah, visualization. That's a powerful tool.
It really is. So imagine yourself speaking English fluently and effortlessly, having conversations with native speakers, expressing yourself with clarity and ease.
I've always found visualization to be really helpful, not just in language learning, but in other areas of life too.
Yeah, me too.
It's like you're creating a mental blueprint for success. You're training your brain to believe that it's possible.
And the more you visualize yourself succeeding, the more likely you are to actually achieve those goals.
So we've talked about celebrating progress, creating a supportive community, and harnessing the power of visualization. But there's one more strategy that this podcast mentions that I think is super powerful. Reframing fear as a catalyst for growth.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Fear can be so paralyzing, especially when it comes to language learning.
For sure.
But this podcast encourages us to see fear as a sign that we're pushing ourselves outside of our comfort zone.
Yeah, it means you're on the verge of something great.
It's like that feeling you get when you're about to go on a roller coaster. There's that mix of excitement and nervousness, like you're about to embark on this thrilling adventure.
And just like with a roller coaster, that initial fear eventually gives way to exhilaration.
And a sense of accomplishment.
Exactly. So embracing those moments of discomfort, those challenges that push us to our limits, that's where the real growth happens.
So how do we apply this to language learning? Let's say you're terrified of speaking English in public. Instead of avoiding those situations, what if you saw them as opportunities to challenge yourself?
Yeah, to stretch your language muscles and build your confidence.
Exactly. Start small. Strike up a conversation with a cashier at the store or order your coffee in English.
Each time you push past that fear and you communicate successfully, you're reinforcing that belief that you can do it.
And those small victories, they build on each other.
They do.
And before you know it, you're giving presentations in English. You're navigating social situations with ease. Maybe even traveling to English-speaking countries.
It's amazing how those small steps can lead to such big changes.
It really is.
It's all about putting in the effort, having the right mindset, and believing in yourself.
And I think that's a perfect note to end on. Language learning is this journey of self-discovery. It's about pushing boundaries, expanding your horizons, and becoming a more confident and well-rounded individual.
So to all of you listening out there, as you continue on your English learning adventures, remember to embrace the challenges, celebrate the victories, and never stop believing in yourself.
Beautifully said. The power to unlock a world of possibilities is within each and every one of you. Keep speaking smart, keep exploring, and most importantly, keep believing in yourself. We'll be back with another deep dive soon. But until then, happy learning.
Happy learning.
Thank you for listening to the Speak Smart podcast.